Hello, it is Saturday night at 10 o'clock. I am Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. And I've got Lissa backing me up behind the scenes this week.
Oh, that would be an orange one. Hello.
Hello. Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Which cat is that?
That's Chandra. That's her spot.
I miss my orange cat.
You gonna lay down?
I am so lucky that I have lots of recordings of Buddy joining the show back in the early days, back in the days of Covert. So I'm very glad to have that. But so tonight I'm going to talk about the Starfleet Museum website because I kept mentioning it while I was talking about the Daedalus class stuff, and I had known about the site for a long time and sort of rediscovered it. And it's pretty darn cool. But I thought it's got some very interesting things, so I thought I'd go ahead and talk about that. And so hello to everybody whose people are still piling in at the last second, which is perfectly fine. So let me go ahead and launch this. Yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Here's a brief agenda. So first, I'm going to start off with the usual admin stuff about what the schedule's looking like. I'll do a little introduction to the Starfleet Museum, what it is, why I'm talking about it, how to navigate through it. There's just a few little things there that I sort of pulled out that I figured I will save you about 5 minutes if I tell you some things about it. Do a little quick in-universe history overview of the time period covered by it, because this is really about the beginning of the Federation. It's about the Earth-Romulan War and stuff like that. That's the time period it focuses on. It basically ends at the original series. I'm going to pull a few examples from stuff that's there, just to show you what some of the artwork looks like. And then I'm going to go through Alan Rolfe's design notes. And I misspelled his name there. There should be 2 S's. Because it's Rolf's and then apostrophe S. But he does a lot of stuff right. And by right, I in part mean that he agrees with me on stuff. But he does a lot of stuff right. And so it's worth going through and sort of talking about a few things. And then I can use it as a sort of a springboard to talk about some things I want to talk about. But first, I want to go back to a question that I asked last week, and I want to ask it again and sort of give people an opportunity to weigh in and tell me if you think it's a bad idea. But I made the comment about how a lot of science fiction channels on YouTube, that people start off talking about the lore of whatever particular thing they do, 40K, Star Trek, whatever. They start off talking about the lore. And at some point they decide they're going to write their own lore. And so you end up going off in this tangent where people are writing their own lore for some period of time. 40K Theories did it. A bunch of other sites did it, etc. In fact, on Space Doc, it became such a big deal that basically the team that did it went off and sort of created their own audio drama and turned over their YouTube channel to somebody else. They hired somebody else. They brought somebody else in, a guy named Hujiwana, who had previously had his own YouTube channel that he still occasionally posts to, but very rarely. And they sort of turned Space Doc over to him. And he does fantastic work, by the way. I really, really, at some point I want to go through and start pulling some of his episodes and talking about some of his episodes and why I like them. That's on the list of things to do. So in any event, being somebody who's sort of like neck deep in the lore of Star Trek and stuff like that, in the past, I've always said that there's all this stuff that's sort of contradictory with each other. And so you can't really make it consistent. You sort of kind of have to pick and choose, but that's okay. And that I go through and I look at what we've seen in sort of the TV shows, what we've seen in Rick Sternbach and Mike Okuda's Star Trek Next Generation technical manual, because I think they really do the best job of covering all that stuff. And I also talk it over with Pat Doyle and Andy Presby. And when I sort of mix through that synthesis, that's sort of what I come up with. And I sort of, paper over a few things here and there too. And once again, I forgot to include the little illustration I want to include about that shows about different types of canon and how people approach canon. I'll try to remember to do that next week. And so, in fact, you know what? I'm going to write that down so I don't forget. And I'm going to take this sticky note. I'm going to put it right there on my computer so I don't forget. Okay, so I've got some ideas. If I were going to sort of put together the Star Trek universe, I've got some ideas. And I got this illustration of the ship up here because this is a good example of some of the ideas I have, because I can give you an explanation as to why you would have one, what the implications of 1 nacelle versus 2 versus 3 versus 4 would be in technical terms. And I sort of, in my head, I call this the ASTD, the alternate Star Trek, the alternate Starfleet technical design is what I sort of call it. And so it's nothing that does too violence to the spirit of the technical design of Star Trek, but I add a few things and I would do stuff like that. And so the question is, do you guys want to see that? Now, last week, some people said that they did. The question is, I have to sort of think about how I would go about doing that, whether I would do like an entire episode or whether I just sort of sprinkle it in here and there. I've been kind of avoiding that in that way. But I guess the question I'd have for you guys is there anybody else out there who can make a good argument as to why this is a bad idea? Right? So a few people have said they want to see it. I want to hear from the people who think, go ahead and tell me if you think it's a good idea. But especially if you think it's a bad idea, if your reaction to that was, oh, if you do that, I'm out of here, sort of deal, or I just really don't want that, et cetera, then let me know. Because my thinking is, I can pull in stuff from sort of how I sort of run in my own headcanon, how I would do the headcanon, and I would also bring in some stuff from, I always say my fandom superpowers, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. And so you're probably going to see some of that in there when I start talking about what exactly is Starfleet and how would it be organized and stuff like that. So let me know. Just let me know. Olive has a good comment. I suppose I'd have to see how it goes. Fair enough. So with that in mind, I just want to toss it out. Feel free to comment in the chat and let's move on. So here's the announcements. So I don't forget to say all this. So my schedule is still in flux, but I think it's sort of firming up. I know I will not be here next week. I do not know where I will be next weekend. I know I won't be here. I will either be in DC or I will be in Iowa. The Weuve family reunion is that week, so there is an inclination for me to go back to the Weuve ancestral homelands. However, I am buying a house. The house is in the DC area. I may have to go to DC this coming week for a home inspection. I am definitely going to have to go to DC the week after that to close on the house. I may just go to DC and stay there all week, in which case I would not be in Iowa doing it. And I probably also wouldn't be trying to do a show remotely from, whatever friend I'm sort of camping with. It doesn't make sense for me to try to do a show there. So no show next week. I think I'll probably do a show on the 28th because I expect that even if I'm in DC on the 25th, I will be back by the 28th. I'll probably come back on the 26th, actually. But so it's probably, there's some possibility I may decide not to do it because I have to, do utilities things and other things like that. And so actually, the more I think about it, that should probably be sort of more of an orangish color because I think it may be more of that kind of probable. Let me think about that a little bit more. I think it's probably a little bit less than I just thought. On the 5th of July, I expect to do a show. I expect that I'll probably be doing a show because I will be back from DC by then. I will be doing the frantically packing and stuff in preparation for movers coming. And I expect that the 12th of July and the 19th of July are probably, that's the window in which I'm going to be moving and stuff like that. I start the new job on the 21st of July. And so I kind of expect that maybe on the 26th, I'll return to normal ops. I went ahead and left it yellow in case I don't at that point, but it could probably be green. And so that's kind of what I'm expecting. The queue as listed below is pretty much the same, except I realized while going through doing the research for this week that I should probably add Rick Sternbach's Spaceflight Chronology to the list of things to talk about, I should go through that book. It's got some very interesting things in that book. And so I'm tentatively decided to put that on there. So this is something that Sternbach basically wrote before he was up to his eyeballs in it. This is just something he wrote more as just a guy who did technical illustration in the industry, but I don't think he was actually a Star Trek guy at that point. He may have been a relatively minor guy. I can't remember when he started working with them. But I want to, it's a book worth looking at. And so I want to take a look at it. So caveats as usual apply. Nothing I say is the position of any of my employers. Nothing I say should make you not enjoy something. I'm interpreting the work of living human beings, and I am not clearing it with them first, and they may tell you that I'm totally and completely wrong. I'm also borrowing some of their illustrations, and my purpose in doing that is for critical and educational commentary. I claim no ownership of that stuff. It is their stuff. I'm just a fan of their stuff, and I'd like to share that stuff with you. So you should go and you should go and enjoy it too. And everything that we're talking about today is fandom stuff. It's not. It's stuff that they can't make any money off of either. So it's worth taking a look at. Okay, so the Starfleet Museum is a website. It's also a book. It's a book that you can buy from the website. In fact, there's only two places you can get it. You can get it from Lulu by going directly to Lulu, or you can get it from Lulu by going to the Starfleet Museum website and click on it, and it'll take you over there. That book is sold at cost, specifically because they can't make money off of it because it's somebody else's IP and they're just doing it as for fandom stuff. The Starfleet Museum is a place where I pulled a lot of stuff on my data list conversations the last couple of episodes. And so I had always known about it. I had bought the book sometime previously, but it was the opportunity to go and sort of go deep down in that site and do a little bit more research there. And it was really, I'd always wanted to sort of do a deep dive on it, and I was really, really enjoying it. I thought it was worth talking about. Now, the people involved don't know I'm talking about them. They don't know I'm using their artwork. I've got no dog in this fight. I get nothing out of this. I'm just a satisfied customer, and I'd like to talk them up a little bit. So that's an important disclaimer, I think. And so that's what it is. So what's the background behind it? So it's a conjectural history of Starfleet and the United Federation of Planets predating the original Star Trek series. I should have put the date here. He started doing this stuff in the late 90s, and he stopped around 2001 or so with sort of creating the new content. He basically stopped about the time that Enterprise came out, because I think that's the time frame it came out, right around there. And so it takes place before Enterprise, and Enterprise, before it was created, before the show Enterprise was created. That's what I'm trying to say. And Enterprise largely negates everything in there. So the Enterprise people probably didn't even know this website existed. They certainly didn't follow it at all. And so basically it used to fill in a hole in the Star Trek canon. It's now at the point where the hole doesn't exist anymore because Star Trek Enterprise was slotted right into that hole. There's a much different design aesthetic there. It's a lot closer to the data list design aesthetic. And you'll see when I start showing you illustrations from it, it does not look like the rest of Star Trek. But you can sort of see, and they intentionally tried to pull off this idea of it's what eventually evolves into the original series. So just like you can sort of follow the design language path from the original series to the movies to the time period before TNG to TNG, you can sort of see over the time period covered by this work, you can see how it's evolving into the original series with that sort of design aesthetic. Started off as a fan publication. Here's an example. and then it got turned into a website by the original creator. And then this guy named Masayo Okazaki, and then a guy named Alan Rolfs came along and said, hey, can I do some deck plans? And Okazaki said, yeah. And there was an addition, there were some changes made to the original stuff to make the deck plans work. And then later a guy named Dan Carlson came along and edited the book, edited by Dan Carlson, and sort of took all the stuff that was on the website and put it into a book form. And now it's up there. And so that's how this came about. And this is one of those things that takes a little bit to sort of piece that out from the website, because like at one point I was saying like Okazaki's got these great write-ups. Well, some of the stuff that I was attributing as a great write-up for him was actually an Alan Rolfe write-up. And at some point I thought Okazaki put together the book. He didn't. It was Dan Carlson who sort of did it as a side project. And so Dan Carlson is the guy, he was one of the co-founders of Memory Alpha. And he's also the guy who does this website called Star Trek Minutia, which has got some very interesting stuff on it as well. And I'll leave it to you to go look at it. And so this is just a very brief overview. I'm not getting very far into it. This book is 282 pages long, and it doesn't include everything that's in the website. Everything that's in here is on the website, but it doesn't include everything because it doesn't include Alan Rolfe's designer notes, which I'm going to talk about tonight because in all of the places where he did deck plans, so there we have some deck plans, right, on this side. In all the places where he did deck plans, he actually included designer notes, and they're not in the book. At least I haven't found any in there yet. Okay, so that's what it is. Why do I want to talk about it? So the reason why I want to talk about it is, first of all, it's a natural follow-on to the data list discussion. Second, it combines several interesting topics. Non-canon, the pre-Star Trek Enterprise version, of course, but several interesting topics. The history of the Earth-Romulan War, the formation of Starfleet from an Earth military and exploratory agencies. He talks about how there was the Navy and there was the Space Probe Agency, and they sort of slammed them together for purposes of fighting the war. And so you sort of had this thing that had these two different approaches to things. And there's a real heavy section on the evolution of ship design from fusion-powered warp-capable ships to matter-antimatter designs, and what the implications of that were and how that process went, and et cetera, et cetera. It's also got these extensive design notes from Alan Rolfes, who went through and did all the deck plans. And they're very thoughtful. And by that, I, of course, mean he shares my philosophy about ship design and has some similar criticisms of how other people do ship designs and deck plans and stuff like that. And we're going to talk about those. So thank you for the soapbox, Mr. Rolfes. And my methodology tonight is just to go through his designer notes and to go through, I'm also going to go through the matter-antimatter stuff a little bit, which I think was written by Okazaki, and talk about sort of, highlight some things and sort of riff off that. And then I'm also going to do a little bit of navigational insight onto just sort of what the site looks like, so that, to make it a little bit easier to get around. Okay, so let's do that stuff first. This is sort of a section of the front page. It actually goes down. You've got the Romulan War, and then there's stuff further on down below. I want to call out a couple of things here. The Alan Rolfe's parts are all under that lower right-hand corner part that says notes. And so there's a part 1 and a part 2. Part 1 has the general designer notes and basically the Romulan War era ships. And then part 2 has the other stuff, the later stuff. And then blue scale is, he talks about how, I think it's the Star Wars floor plan community came up with a particular scale that they used for stuff, and he wasn't originally going to use it, and he decided to go ahead and use it. So he basically, some of the layouts, some of them are in multiple designs, multiple scales. And there's more than one version of the layout. He did them both, and he retrofitted some changes after because he basically went to a scale that allowed more detail, and so he put more detail in. And so that's what that's all about. And he explains all of that in that blue scale section and how all that sort of fit together and why he did what he did, et cetera. But the end result is that you can click on a link and go to a place and you think that you've seen the thing, and there's other parts of the thing, right? You click on a particular ship and you think you've read everything there is about the ship, except you haven't read Alan Rolfe's notes about how he put together the layouts for the ship. And oh, by the way, it's also in blue scale, and so you need to go look at the blue scale version too. So it's worth just pointing out that sometimes the same thing is covered in multiple places, different stuff, but it's all about the same topic. There's a section on that special research collection. That's just sort of the rough drafts of the ships and sketches and stuff like that. That's sort of an out of universe thing. So some of this stuff here on the website is in universe, some of it's out of universe. And then there's also this really interesting article about the development of matter antimatter drives and how that's important. And there's also a bit in there that's actually not in there, that's in one of the ship histories, and I'll talk about that towards the end, that talks about how one of the early matter antimatter ships was basically responsible for something that led them to win the war, because it just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and it was able to do some stuff, and I'll talk about that. Okay, so next. So here's the history overview of sort of how they sort of view the development of history, doing it all in one slide. It's about a page and a half of notes on the website. So before the war, Earth had been united, had formed a government called United Earth, and had about 50 years of peace and prosperity. They had colonies out to about 6 parsecs away from Earth. They had friendly relations with the Vulcans, the Tellarites, and the Andorians. And the only real thing that they had a navy, but it was really more a counter-piracy force. There wasn't anybody out there who was really kind of gunning for them. But at some point, they noticed there were some scout ships from sort of an unidentified power. It wasn't anybody they recognized, but they saw these scout ships and they sort of went, okay, there's somebody else out there. Let's go try to find them. So they sent scouts out looking for them. And next thing you know, the Romulans have apparently interpreted this as a hostile act. It's not really clear as to why they did what they did, but they attack a human colony, and they have some early successes early on because they very much have a star navy that's intended to go and whoop on people, not just deal with pirates. So Earth is sort of behind the gap in that regard. At some point during the second year of the war, though, the tide turns, and that's because the Stellar Navy, the UE Stellar Navy, manages to destroy an invasion fleet at something called the Battle of Vela Gap. And that's this incident where this early matter antimatter cruiser, most of the ships used deuterium, they used fusion drives, but this was an early matter antimatter cruiser, happened to stumble across Romulan tankers that were heading off to tank up the invasion fleet. And I'll talk about the importance of tankers with fusion later. But the short answer is that the fusion fuel stuff, they're using prodigious amounts of fusion fuel, prodigious amounts, and they've got a relatively limited range. And these tankers are going off to refuel the invasion fleet. This cruiser, the Bowen, manages to schwack those tankers, and it immediately calls for help. And a task force comes out it's like a task force of 15 ships against a group of like 50 ships, but the group of 50 ships is running low on fuel. And this antimatter equipped task force comes out and basically slaughters them all. Basically, they've won the battle, and the remaining Romulan ships just self-destruct to avoid capture, which is why we don't, as you recall from the original series, we don't actually know that they're the same. They're basically an offshoot of the Vulcans. And so this sort of turns the tide, and then the Stellar Navy goes, oh, this matter antimatter stuff is really working out for us well. And so that gives them the wherewithal to actually do a counter invasion, and they're able to sort of force the Romulans to a peace deal. So there's some salient points about the conflict that are worth highlighting here. So first of all, fusion drives are inherently limited in terms of their ability to do offensive operations because they're slow and they're very logistics intensive. They are fuel hogs. And so they talk about it takes 150 days for them to go like 10 light years, or I think it was 10 light years. Maybe it was actually just to Alpha Centauri. It's like 150 days. And so matter antimatter cuts that in half and means that when you get there, you still got a lot of fuel left over. In fact, they specifically talk about how later on about how those early ships, they put the fuel bottle in at the factory, and the language is very much like refueling a nuclear submarine. You get the antimatter fuel they in a magnetic bottle. They have to take hull plates off to replace the bottle, and then you just have to get some hydrogen or something to react with it. You don't fusion fuel to react with it. You don't have to actually replace the matter antimatter except once every couple of years. The Romulans never matched this technology. In fact, none of the other powers matched that technology. It spread from us to our allies, despite the fact that Earth was not really trying to share it, but it sort of got out. And then it eventually ended up spreading to the Klingons. And so the comment was they were only mildly surprised when the Klingons show up and they've got matter antimatter capabilities that look almost exactly like the Federation's, because it was such a good thing that it got out into the wild and everybody and their brother immediately did it. But the museum is really about this transitional period where matter antimatter is replacing fusion. And so some of the ships get converted to the new fusion fuel. And so Rolf spends a lot of time talking about, okay, so this is how, the deuterium tanks can be smaller now because they're using less of it. You're getting so much more energy out of it. So what do they do with the extra space? And, well, you need to beef up the reactor in order to deal with the higher power. It's a lot more power this way. And originally it was sort of like a fusion reactor that they were adding antimatter into. Some of them could be modified, some of them couldn't. So some of them could be replaced, some of them couldn't. So it was kind of, some ships were of a design that it was worth upgrading, some weren't, others were scrapped. And if you're just tooling around locally, like this, they had these sleeper ship things that if you're doing a sleeper ship run, you don't really need the speed. Everybody's asleep. And so some of those ships stayed in operation for a long, long time until they finally wore out. Some of them were scrapped right away and replaced, and some of them were converted. So it's an interesting little story there. So here's a map of the war. I'm just going to throw it up just very briefly, but this is something that's in the book and on the website. It's a pretty high quality map. I kind of like it. You can see it's color coded for altitude to sort of give you some three-dimensional effects there. And so I'm going to go through some examples here. Here's example one, anatomy of a ship. This is a Bison class transport. The decks are stacked vertically like buildings. If you look at the front end, you can see there's a list of, they've got windows all the way around. So that would be people looking up, looking out the windows. I've circled the warp drives here. These are deuterium fueled ships that have warp drives, not antimatter. And as you can see, the thing comes in a couple of different versions. So at its base level, it's got one reasonably beefy warp drive. And in some cases, they add extra warp drives to make it more maneuverable at warp and to give it a little bit extra power. And as you can see for that top one, which is just the cargo version, when they added those extra warp drives to make it a little bit more maneuverable, they shrunk the size of the main warp drive. Whereas in that passenger liner down below, it's got a pretty big warp drive. On the right-hand side, you can see I've got a single thing circled with a yellow circle. That's an impulse engine. And so you've got impulse engines there. So the cylinder is basically the people tank. It's the primary hull. He calls the sphere the secondary hull. I would call it the engineering hull in this case, because it's still the same hull, but it's all one continuous thing. And then you've got the warp drive sort of stuck on the back there. And they talk about how the manufacturer was sort of proud of the fact that no two Bisons were the same. It was heavily customized, and so they were making different versions for everybody, and you could order it with warp drive, this warp drive or that warp drive, etc. And so there were several derivatives of it. So follow-on ships of a different class where they clearly started with this. They didn't start with a clean sheet. They started with this and made changes. And there was also some specialty vehicles. Down below, we have one here that is the Marconi class which is a subspace relay. That's what that giant dish is. And so it was basically, they took the cargo hold and they turned it into a like a module that would slide in that had this big subspace relay dish that would stick out the side, and they could send this off to function as a relay. And so this is sort of shows you the design aesthetic here. And so I talked about how it's vertically stacked decks like a building. So let's do a little sidebar and talk about deck orientation for a second. Vertical stacking lets you orient along the direction of thrust. And so, you know, a lot of times it would make more sense if you don't have something like artificial gravity, and they did have artificial gravity at this point. But it would make more sense in some cases to have vertically. And this is one of the things that always sort of gripes me in science fiction, is that a lot of times it would make sense for it to be vertical and it wouldn't be. But there's a reason why you want to go horizontal, and it's not just the reason that we all understand ships, and it's, you know, it's a spaceship, so it must be a ship, right? And so they have horizontal decks. Why would we make it like a building if it's a ship? Well, aside from that, you also pay more of a penalty. And the penalty you pay is the space necessary to get in between the levels, elevators, stairways, things like that. And so the fewer times you have to go in between decks like that, the fewer elevators, stairways, etc. space that you need, right? You lose a certain percentage of each floor to your elevators and your stairways. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, designing a really, really tall building is kind of problematic, because there's always this danger that your elevators are going to take over and you end up building a building that's nothing but elevators. Because in order to move the people around through a shaft that runs the entire length of the elevator or the entire height of the building, that gets kind of difficult to plan that out. And so you end up doing all these interesting tricks, including at the ThyssenKrupp facility, elevator construction facility in Germany. There is something that really kind of looks like a turbo lift. It's an elevator that has linear induction motors along the rails, and it can go up and then it reorients the motor part, turns 90 degrees, and then it will move sideways. There's a Tom Scott video where he visits that plant. It's really pretty cool. That's why I know about it. So I think the correct answer matters based upon your technology assumptions. And so if you are going to have thrust like this, you know, something that potentially could push you down into your seat or something like that, you want to be vertically oriented. If you're not going to have it, maybe not. It has implications for landing. It has implications for how you're going to do stuff, how you're, you know, how much space you take up when you're landing. It has implications for docking arms, all sorts of stuff. The example here is their Cervantes light frigate that I bought. I bought the book off of Drive-Thru RPG. It's by a company called 0 Hours, and they do all sorts of illustrations. And so you may recall that Cervantes is the author of Don Quixote. Don Quixote, the character, had a horse. His horse was named Rocinante. So, this kind of looks like the Rocinante from The Expanse, doesn't it? What a coincidence. In any event, one of the things that's sort of interesting about this product is that he's very aware of the fact that some people don't like vertical stacking. And so he actually does both. He gives you deck plans in both layouts. So nice way to illustrate the point. Okay. So here's some more examples. I'm just going to go through and show the aesthetic. Now, there's one little inconsistency here. They talk about the Earth-Romulan War, but they also talk about the Andorians were part of the Alliance. And so why they keep saying Earth-Romulan War when it's the Earth and Andorians against the Romulans War. But luckily, Andorians have thick skins and are unlikely to take offense, because they never take offense about anything, right? But this is sort of the design aesthetic. You can see, you know, there's the data list down there. It's got the separate warp engines. You start seeing it move over time from this thing that's basically cylinders with a warp engine sort of stuck on to the back, to they start putting warp engines on the sides, and you see it slowly start to evolve into sort of like a primary hull and a secondary hull that are connected somehow, and they've got engines. And so this is the time period from 2156 to 2160. These are all ships that were in existence during the war. Those ones labeled Little Nell and Little Nell 2, those are specifically antimatter testbed ships. Those aren't warships. Those were testing antimatter drive reactor systems. We'll come back to that later. Okay, so here's a little bit after that. Here's for the 100 years after the war. And so you'll note there's some old friends in there. You not only have the data lists in there still, but if you look down the lower left-hand corner, you can see what it all evolved into, right? You can see some stuff in there that's looking more and more like a Constitution-class cruiser. And finally, you end up with a Constitution-class cruiser. And you also see some stuff that overlapped with the previous slide because things like the Comet and the Daedalus hung around for a while afterwards. So they were ships that had that antimatter capability, and they hung around for a while. And here's just what the Klingon and the Federation fleet looked like a little bit later on. And so he does do a little bit on Klingons. He does a little bit on Romulans. All the Romulan ships are kind of ugly, so I didn't include them here. And I there's plenty of stuff to talk about, so I did feel the need to include them. But he primarily does Starfleet ships and United Earth ships before that. Okay, so Rolf's design notes. I do not expect you to read that, but the parts in red I'm going to go through. I'm leaving a bunch of stuff out because it wasn't interesting enough to go through. But I'm going to talk about the stuff in red, and I'm going to talk about some examples from some specific ships. I see that there's some questions here, and I'll go back and do those at the end. Let's see. So first of all, Rolf talks about designing the inside of the ship. He says, where possible, the hallway and the main bulkhead configuration should be identical between decks, because that lets you do a high bay. And so, you might go into a space and it's twice as high, 3 times as high, because there's a big piece of gear there, right? One of my recurring themes is I hate these things that look like buildings because they ignore the fact that ships have big pieces of gear. Generally, they're lower down in the hull, which is the engineering section of a ship, is the part down below. But you get down there and you don't have decks like you do at other places. Sometimes you'll go into a high bay and what you've got are catwalks because you've got a big engine there and you've just got a catwalk that goes around it. And so Rolf does that. Rolf does that. And then he also talks about how layouts by others ignore or minimize structural support and utility transfer stuff. So like they just don't have a frame to the ship. That takes up a lot of space. Just the framing takes up a lot of space. And so, for instance, I think probably we're all fans of the Franz Josef design Enterprise blueprints. I loved them as a kid. I still love them. Oh my God, are they wrong? They're just wrong in a lot of ways. And one of them is he doesn't understand things like this. Rolf puts in keels, et cetera, et cetera. There are places where it's just marked, this is structure. This is what keeps the ship from falling apart. And they also, a lot of times, you don't see any space for machinery and you just see crew areas everywhere. Whereas, real ships have fuel tanks. Real ships have places where there's just big pieces of machinery. If you're on an aircraft carrier, if you're walking around, it just looks like you've got deck space here, right? But if you pay attention, you'll realize I'm walking around something. There's a thing here. I go around it. The passageways lead around it, but there's no way to get into it. Or if there is a way to get into it, it's one of the doors that's marked that basically says, this is maintenance only. You don't go into this normally. This is maintenance only. Some of those doors, you actually have to use a wrench to get open because they don't actually... It's basically a cover has nuts and bolts holding it in place. It doesn't actually have hinges on a door. And so that's places where like the elevator that's going up to the flight deck that carries ordnance, or it might be fuel lines or something like that. And you just don't have access to that. And so Rolfs tries to include stuff like that. Franz Josef notoriously did not. I have a hypothesis about that, by the way. Franz Josef was a professional draftsman. He had engineering training and he knew how to draw things because he designed some of the pylons in the F-111 aircraft. He was an aircraft guy. He wasn't a ship guy. He was an airplane guy. And so looking at this stuff, what I see is an airplane guy who's trying to do ships. That's kind of what it looks like to me. And so love his stuff. Thank God they exist. Love the technical manual. Love everything. Well, don't love everything about it. I clearly don't love everything about it. You know, still have extremely fond memories. I spent hours going over those blueprints. Yeah, they're wrong. Okay, designing the outside of it. The outside should reflect things that are going on in the inside, right? So if the shape changes for some reason, that's because there's something on the inside. And so like part A, the cylinder there, that's the people part. Part B is the engineering part. So it looks different. Now, there's one thing he does that actually kind of drives me crazy. And that is, if you remember back to the original photo of the Bison, the original drawings of the Bison that had the warp engines up front. Okay, you're going to run warp plasma forward along the sides of the people tank to get to those engines? Do you really want to do that? Maybe the answer is you have to for some reason involving how subspace works, et cetera, and you really kind of have to put those extra engines there to get the effect that you're trying to get out of it. But I kind of look at that and go, I don't know. I mean, this is kind of crazy. Now, on the flip side, on an aircraft carrier, you can be sitting in the mess hall, sitting in the galley, and you look over and you see there's piping, and some of those pipes are purple. And purple means that's aviation fuel. That's a petroleum product, and it's running right through the mess area because you have to run those pipes wherever you have to run those pipes. And they make it purple so that if you have to do damage control, you know that that's fuel, right? And so maybe it's just something like that. But it's interesting if you think about it, though, because we saw Starfleet move towards this idea that the people tank and the engineering plant should be separate. And you should be able to detach the people tank from the engineering plant. Because presumably it could go boom. And so you can make an argument that, okay, when they're just dealing with fusion stuff, okay, a fusion accident would be bad, but probably it's just going to burn itself out, right? You're not necessarily expecting it to go high order like this thing would, unless you take severe amounts of damage, in which case you're just screwed anyway. But when you start playing around with antimatter, maybe we need to take some extra precautions, and maybe it took a little while for us to decide what those extra precautions were going to be. And so I said in one of the previous episodes that my hypothesis is that they lost enough of the dataless class that they said, we kind of need to make the primary hull detachable because we may lose secondary engineering hulls. And so we might want to think about that. And I'm going to come back to that in a slide or two. Okay, so the ship should be treated as like a holistic whole. And he talks a lot about the calculations done to do stuff. And it basically boils down to things like the size of your fuel tank determines what your range is going to be. And most of what the cargo area is carrying is consumables for the crew. And so the cargo area and the crew area are not independent variables. You need to have enough cargo to support the crew. If you have too much cargo, you've got excess cargo unless you're like delivering something, et cetera, right? There are reasons why you might want to have extra cargo, but at a minimum, you need to have enough cargo to carry the consumables for the crew, because this is in the days before replicators and stuff like that. So you need to have the consumables for the crew. And so you need to sort of right size this stuff. And also, you need to multiply all that by the endurance of the ship, right? So 5 guys or, 50 guys over the course of a year are going to consume more than 50 guys over the course of 2 months. So if your ship has an endurance of 2 months, it doesn't need to stockpile food for a year, that sort of stuff. So basically, he just basically says that he balances all that stuff out accordingly to try to get it into a ratio that makes sense. It also includes escape pods in there too, right? You need to have enough escape pods for everybody. So let's talk about, he talks a little bit about the Bison specifically. That's the ship I showed you earlier. Just like modern day, the most efficient way to store large amounts of small miscellaneous cargo is in various standard sized boxes, which can be stacked with no wasted space between them. This cargo ship is designed to hold a lot of these containers the same way a cargo is stacked on ocean International Standards Organization container ships, right? So you should have containers and they should all stack nicely. Now, let's compare it with this monstrosity, right? This is the cargo bay of the Enterprise from Star Trek: The Motion Picture. What's wrong here? You've got cargo modules that don't stack. They need a special holder. They not only don't stack, they're a weird shape. And so you have to put them in, you have to orient them depending upon whether they're top or bottom, left or right. And when you take it out, if you sort of look at those ones down there, what they've done is they've taken it out and rotated it 90 degrees in order to get it down on the deck and make it tall enough. So every single cargo container there is loaded at a 90-degree angle to the way that it's eventually stored, and some of them are flipped to the left and some of them are flipped to the right. Does that make any sense to anybody? So you're just going to put stuff in there, and then you're just going to say, all right, turn it over, flip it over, stuff it in there. This is the dumbest cargo system I've ever seen. And so, and I immediately thought about it when I read this comment that Rolf's put in about the Bison. So let's talk about Little Nell for just a second. Little Nell was that, I would have included an illustration here, but as you can see, lots of words already. Little Nell was basically a lozenge-shaped, capped cylinder-shaped antimatter test ship. And he talks about how the early generation matter-antimatter reactors in his background are nothing more than supercharged fusion reactors. You start them up as a normal fusion reactor, and then you just start throwing a little bit of antimatter in it to spike it. And you see that this is the point, incidentally, at which I said, I should do spaceflight chronology too, because Sternbach talks about that as well. And I suspect that might be where they got it, is that they got it from spaceflight chronology, where they talk about how you're sort of spiking stuff. And so you have to make the reactor a little bit beefier because it's going to be higher power loads, but you're just sort of plopping it in. He also goes on to point out something really kind of important, which is that this idea that it's a 1-to-1 ratio of matter to antimatter. Okay, you're creating a plasma afterwards. If you mix 1-to-1, there's no plasma, because it mutually annihilates, and all you get is like X-rays and gamma rays and shit. You don't get any plasma. Plasma is matter. All the matter goes away in that case. And so, you're trying to get a reaction of some sort, but you want to energize this plasma as a result. And he talks about how there's always regular matter in there, and that the first matter-antimatter reactors, they had a ratio that was like 1,000-to-1. So mostly deuterium with a little bit of spiking of antimatter in there to sort of like supercharge that. And that they called that low energy plasma because there just wasn't that much antimatter. And so it didn't get super spiked, and that as the reactors became better and they used less and less extra matter in there, and it got closer to being 1-to-1, because what they lost in the fact that they had less matter, they made up for in the fact that there was the plasma they had wasn't diluted as much, and it was way more energetic. And this is also where he talks about how the antimatter bottles in this era are filled at the factory. You take the hull of the ship apart, you put the bottle in, and you come back 2 years later when it's empty, and you do that again. That you don't go to the filling station and fill them up. You don't routine do this. It is a major evolution. And that's exactly how like early nuclear submarines work. The Nautilus got refueled every 2 years approximately. More modern submarines, the ones today, they try to build reactors that will have enough oomph for the entire life of the reactor. But back in the days of Nautilus, they had to refuel every 2 years. And so every 2 years, she'd go 18 months to 2 years, she'd go into the shipyard for 6 months, and they take the hull apart to get to the fuel rods, because that's kind of how that worked back then. Okay, so let's talk about the development of antimatter drives, because there's some interesting stuff in that section. You may recall I called out, I said, this is an interesting part here on when I was doing the navigation thing. This comes from that section. And so he specifically, this is Okazaki, I think, who's talking about this here. Because of these limitations on range, speed, and payload, fusion-powered ships are unsuited for offensive interstellar operations. You can do it in a heartbeat, right? If it's the only thing you got, you'll make it happen. But you have huge logistic trails, etc. In fact, there's a bit in there where they're talking about how the people of Earth wanted the Federation, wanted the Navy to go on the offensive against the Romulans. We beat them in this big battle. Now's the time to go get them. And the Navy's going like, you guys don't quite understand. That's way harder than you think. And we don't have the logistics trained to do that, because we're a force that was designed to fight pirates. And so we don't have the logistics. We're okay defensively, because we can always fall back on a base and refuel there. But the idea of power projection is hard. And so this is one of the reasons why I always cringe when people in the real world talk about, we got too much support stuff and not enough trigger pullers. They talk about the tooth to tail ratio being wrong, that we need to have more tooth, right? More guys on the pointy end. Well, more guys on the pointy end means you need more pointy end, because if you can't support those guys, if you can't move them around because you don't have the transport for it, you need more guys, because they're going to fight in place. And so if you want to make your force more effective, more mobile, etc., you have more support, not less. And that's what this is getting at. And so he goes on to say, for an attack to succeed, it must be made either when or where the enemy is least prepared, or with an overwhelming superiority of force. But you've got this 10 light year range, and you have to refuel multiple times. And every time you do that, you drop out of warp, and it slows you down. And, you can take advantage of that fact. And implicit in all of this is that the sensors are just phenomenal, in the same way that sensors are traditionally phenomenal in Star Trek. They can detect from really long distances. That, in my mind, is kind of a questionable assumption, but all right, I'll press the I believe button on it. And that the warp factors are relatively low. So he talks about a 10 light year journey takes at least 150 days. And so the longer your journey, the greater the likelihood that you're going to be spotted. And because you're carrying so much fuel, and because you have to carry so much food for the crew and stuff like that, the amount of weapons that you can carry is actually a lot lower. Matter-antimatter drives, reactors, make this a lot better, because you can move faster, and you don't have to carry as much fuel, so you can carry more weapons. So obviously they just jumped all over that, right? The Admiralty would say, we want that, right? Well, no, they had some concerns, and they're very valid concerns. First one is, this is antimatter. It go boom. It can really go boom quite badly. Do we really want to risk going boom. And there's a reference to a report that a think tank did that said, yeah, you can probably expect one containment failure for every 15 ships you have per year. So regardless of combat, regardless of all other risks, just 1 out of 15 ships is just going to go boom because of a containment failure each year. Now, that turned out to be really pessimistic, that the problems they had weren't anything like that. But if you go and you look at, you may recall from some of the data list stuff I talked about, there's at least one write-up of the data list. I think it's actually in this, where they talk about they started losing ships and they didn't know why, and they called all the ships in, all the data list class ships in, and realized these ships had never been designed to just operate on 5-year missions sort of stuff. They had been designed to sort of like, you go out for 150 days and then you go into port. And so that when they pulled the ships back and started like tearing apart the reactors to see if they had a problem, oh my God, they had a lot of ships that were close to failure and they didn't even realize it. So the second reason why the Admiralty was maybe a little skeptical, a little concerned, was that it's going to take a lot of effort to bring these new ships online. We're going to have to train crews to do it. We're going to have to basically change all the physical plant, et cetera, and all that stuff means that we're going to have a hard time maintaining fleet numbers, because the new thing is going to, almost by definition, is going to take more effort than the old thing did, at least at the beginning. And can we really afford to let the fleet get smaller in the middle of the war? So maybe it's not worth it. And the last thing is antimatter is expensive and scarce. And so it wouldn't be good if we converted over to an antimatter fleet and then didn't have enough antimatter to go around. But in the end, quote, the advantage that matter-antimatter ships gave the UESN cannot be overstated. With the higher speeds and greater ranges possible, the Navy could choose when and where to engage the Romulan fleet, and it could attack too many targets for the Romulans to adequately protect. In fact, in the background, they talk about how the Romulans, there was a group of Romulan officers who very quickly figured out, oh shit, we're going to lose. There's no way we don't have the technology. There's no way that we can compensate for this. They're already outproducing us. And now there's no way that we can win. And so they basically went to the Praetor and said, hey, boss, we need to seriously consider just asking them for negotiations and try to negotiate a peace. And the answer was that they were all killed because that was defeatist. That's not the Romulan way. So they killed all those guys. And then they fought the war for another 2 years and lost anyway. So that's it on the development of matter-antimatter drives. And that's actually the end of the slides. So let me pull me up like that. And now I'm going to go and scroll back to the front and look at questions. Scrolling. Okay, there's the beginning of the show. I haven't seen Jim Westbrook in a while either. Cosmo Flanker said he checked it out after the last episode, and it really is a cool site. Yeah, I mean, it's seriously cool. And I mean, 282 pages. And the website has more stuff. I mean, it's just fantastic. The only thing the website doesn't have, and I've actually sent an email to Dan Carlson, and I sent an email to Akazaki about this. It's like, what I really want is a PDF copy of this. But I'm actually seriously thinking on my list of things to do in my voluminous free time when I'm not busy buying a house or designing a game or doing the show or doing stuff like that, I'm kind of tempted to go through the website and try to download all this stuff and kind of recreate this with the ship notes in it. But that way madness lies, and so I probably won't do that. But there's part of me that really wants to. Okay, so Bob says I should go for it. Thank you, Bob. Scrolling. Delon, yeah, possibly. Yeah, the Explorer says, just wondering how the field that surrounds each nacelle would interact with each other, being that close to others. That's always the thing, is that you clearly see lots of different designs where nacelles are close together and they're far apart, et cetera, et cetera. And when I think about this, when in my own headcanon, in my own alternate Starfleet technical doctrine sort of stuff, technical design, I actually have an explanation as to why you would want them far apart and why you'd want them closer together. Far apart makes them more maneuverable. Close together makes them faster. And it has to do with how subspace works. In fact, at one point in here, I think I've got it highlighted, but I didn't mention, and he talks about something that basically is subspace friction or something like that. I forget exactly how he phrases it, but there's clearly a lot of things talk about this sort of like warp dynamics, sort of subspace. If you make the ship sort of compact, it can go faster, but there are other implications of that, right? And so I also think that it makes sense that the navigational deflector, if you look at the front view of the Constitution class, that's pretty close to an equilateral triangle. If you look at where the nacelles are and where the deflector is. And so that makes me wonder if that's an accident or not, or if that ratio is very precisely determined, whether the lengths of those sides are very precisely determined because they've got 3 warp generating devices there, and maybe they're trying to prevent mutual interference, or maybe they're trying to have constructive interference in a way that works well for them. And so maybe that's why they are the way they are. So Bob says, just make vertically stacked ships much wider than they are tall. I'm not sure they're vertically stacked at that point, but I get the point you mean on that, right? You may have other considerations that you have to take into account. So, and Olive points out they would get acceleration stresses in that case too. Delon says his bifocals may melt. I'm not sure why. Bob points out the most efficient spacecraft design could be argued to be a sphere. It depends upon what. So yes, if what you're trying to do is maximize the interior and minimize the exterior. And so that might be what you're trying to do. But it's also worth pointing out that the exterior is the place where you put stuff, right? The exterior is the place where you put weapons. It's the place where you put sensors. It's the place where you put radiators and things like that. And so this is one of the things that you run into when the US Navy went from having a magazine deep in the ship and ways of bringing the missiles up, and then you had launchers. And so those old launchers did have an advantage that the missile would be pointing in the direction they wanted the missile to go. None of this, we're going to go up real high and then come back over that you get with vertical launch systems. They went with vertical launch systems because vertical launch systems let you basically put within the certain parameters, you can put anything in those tubes, right? As long as it fits in the tube, you can put it in the tube. And as long as the fire control system can handle it. So you don't have to change all the internals, et cetera, et cetera. You're not limited to, well, it's got to be the same form factor as Tartar because it's a Tartar launcher. And if it's not the same form factor as Tartar, it won't work. You can do all sorts of stuff. And so they put big missiles and small missiles. And in some of those vertical launch tubes, they put a quad pack of missiles for the really small stuff. But the problem with that stuff is I need deck space for all of that. Right. And so if I want to add more missiles, I generally have to add more deck. How do I add more deck? I make the ship bigger. And so, and it has to, it's in a very specific place. It's not buried down in the ship. It's right there, right? So you've got some very serious limitations. So if you're trying to do stuff with the skin of the ship, right? If the skin of the ship is valuable real estate, you might not want to be minimizing the surface area. I think in general you probably do want to minimize the surface area. I think there's a lot of, if nothing else, from an armoring perspective, right? Everything I said is exactly the opposite from an armoring perspective, right? If I'm going to put 10% of, or let's pick an actual number. If I'm going to put 1,000 tons of armor on, if I'm covering a small sphere, that's thicker armor than if I'm covering a big sphere, right? And so from an armoring perspective, you want to minimize that stuff, especially since you don't have to deal with flotation like you do in a regular ship. So, okay. Not falling apart is good. Long, interesting discussion here. Stephen Ross points out the extra engines were on the cargo version. They might not have considered it as bad as a risk. Yeah, those cargo guys, you know, they blow up, they get killed. Yeah, good point. Good point. They may have just, you know, had the ability to have extra shielding and stuff in there, so it wasn't as big a deal. You know, maybe, you know, crossing the street is risky. Certainly being in an antimatter powered ship is risky. So everybody sort of accepts a certain amount of risk, right? Every time you get in an airplane, you're accepting a certain amount of risk. Let's see. So somebody asked, did Starfleet post-burn use superfusion reactors? Again, I have absolutely no idea. That's Discovery. I don't pay any attention to Discovery. So might make sense, but, you know, it's Discovery, so making sense isn't part of their design criteria. If you like Discovery, more power to you. That was, I usually don't slag Discovery, I just say I don't watch it. So that was a rare instance of me actually saying something derogatory about Discovery in public. Let's see. There's another burn thing I just don't know anything about. Yeah, Dustin points out the Miranda class is more compact than the Constitution class. A while ago, 60 episodes, maybe more, I spent some time talking about the Mirandas versus the Constitutions. And I have a hypothesis coming from talking with Andy Presby about that. I think the Mirandas, I think when I look at the Mirandas, I see a ship that is not an explorer. That there are certain ships that are explorers and other ships that aren't. And what defines an explorer from a non-explorer is an explorer has a really big navigational deflectors and relatively big engines, and what makes it and a great endurance. And you need that navigational deflector to go a long distance because it's going to be going a long distance and it needs to get there fast. And part of the reason why it needs to get there fast is because of things like consumables on board. And part of it's just it's going a long distance, right? If you got to go 100 miles and your option is to go 100 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour, you know, which one gets you there sooner, right? And so the idea is that you look at the Miranda and you go, okay, that ship is slower and it's not really designed for the exploration mission. And empirically, we don't really see Mirandas doing exploration missions. We saw the Miranda in Wrath of Khan when it was introduced. It was doing a survey mission in a place that was, by that point, probably relatively routine Federation space area. It wasn't like out in the, you know, wasn't the crew of the ship in Wrath of Khan, in the Reliant, they were not boldly going where no man has gone before. They were by definition going to some place that people had gone before. And I think that's because they were not an explorer. They were doing a behind the line survey mission. So yeah, the Miranda was supposed to be a light cruiser when it was launched. I actually think it's sort of funny if you go back and you actually somebody has done the calculation. The Miranda is actually bigger than the Constitution. And it's because of that extension on the primary hull, right? It's not a circle, it's a wedge, and it's a wedge that is taller. And when you add that in, the part they added onto the primary hull is greater than the secondary hull of the Constitution in terms of size. Now they've got 2 big shuttle bays there, so that probably eats up a lot of the mass. A lot of it's hollow. You can also use those shuttle bays for storage, right? So that effectively it's probably a cargo bay too. But that ship is bigger than people always think. The Miranda is a smaller ship. It is not a smaller ship. It's pretty good size. Okay, let's see. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions, and we are at the 1 hour and 11-minute mark. And so I think that probably the right answer is for us to declare victory. And so, like I said, yeah, Dustin also points out one last thing. Dustin points out that the Miranda outguns the Constitution. I think the Miranda is kind of intended to be a warship, and the Constitution is an explorer first that can be a warship if it has to be, and the Miranda is a warship first that can do some survey missions if it has to. And so you don't put big ass guns like that. But think of the political situation that we're in. What is the recurring theme of the original series? It's sort of in the background. The recurring geopolitical theme in the background is there are enemies out there. We got the Klingons. We fought a war with the Klingons. And we were getting ready to fight another one if it hadn't been for the Organians. And we had fought a war with the Romulans, and the Romulans are getting uppity again, right? And you've got Starfleet doing things like the M5 computer. You really think the M5 computer was there to make exploration easier? I don't think M5 had anything to do with exploration. I think M5 was all about being a combat system. And you see it used as a combat system, right? They've just installed the M5. What are they going to do with it? They're going to do a war game with it. They don't say, let's let the M5 go explore someplace. No, they say, we're going to do a war game with it, right? And so it totally makes sense to me that they build the Miranda, because at that point, they're getting ready for the war with the Klingons. They're getting ready for the war with the Romulans. They know that war is coming, and they need to be ready for it. And Starfleet at that point is very much focused on, however many different missions they have, they are focused on the fact that they are the defense force for the Federation, and they have to be prepared to go to war. And then they make peace with the Klingons. The Romulans go away. World's looking pretty good at that point, right? It's sort of funny that Next Generation came out before the fall of the Berlin Wall, because it really, really looks like a show that was designed to sort of capture the end of the Cold War. But it actually came out before the end of the Cold War. The Star Trek Cold War, the Federation Klingon Cold War had already ended by that point. So that was kind of interesting in that regard.
I'm just going to point out, in history, the writing typically is on the wall. And so it coming out when it did was kind of mirroring real life circumstances of, hey, things are starting to decline.
Not in 1988. Or
the actual start of the fall of the Soviet Union did start around that time. Like, if you study historical context of it, what historians consider the start of the fall is around that time.
So this is my Jeopardy category. I was getting a master's degree in this at the time when it happened. I was working on my master's in national security studies when it went down. And you had some people like Andrei Amalrik, who in 1974 wrote a book that said, will the Soviet Union last until 1984? I read the book in 1984 when it was reproduced, and he basically called it. He was just off by a few years about all the internal stresses within the system.
I mean, a lot of these things, like...
But in 1986, so when did Next Gen come out? When did...
89.
No, it was before that because I'm almost positive it was before that. And the reason why I think that is because I'm pretty sure it came out when I was in undergrad and I left.
87. Excuse me.
Yeah, 87. So it was 88 where you really sort of started seeing that stuff. In 87, so by 1987, you had Andropov, you had Chernenko, Gorbachev was in power, and things were looking better in 1987, but it wasn't immediately clear that the Russians were just going to go away. And so, yeah, I mean, the handwriting might have been on the wall, but it wasn't obvious. For most people in the business, if you said, "Oh, the Soviet Union is going to go away," they're going to say, "I think it's equally possible that the reforms that they're making are going to rejuvenate the Soviet Union, and they're going to be around for a lot longer."
Well, that ended up again, like
turned out.
One of these things is just it can go either way, but same could be said about U.S. history in recent years.
Yep.
So the writing has been on the wall in our case too, because I called this shit when I was 9, Chris.
A lot of times it's hard to see the writing on the wall until after it's happened. So I don't give Gene Roddenberry and the writers of Star Trek the assumption of amazing powers of prognostication.
Oh no! See, here's the thing.
It was wishful thinking on their part.
The pattern recognition is there. Whether or not the pattern actually ends up patterning depends on how cards end up falling.
I think it was wishful thinking on their part. It turned out that actually happened, so that was good. But in any event, I mean, it is sort of interesting. The important point there is that what you have in the time period of the movies is very much of a Cold War going on. When Wrath of Khan comes out in 1982. Nobody thought the Soviet Union was going away in 1982.
Oh no!
And so the Miranda is very much a ship designed to fight the war that everybody sees coming. So, okay, let's see.
Yes, when TNG came out, the consensus was that the Soviets were not keeping pace. Like, it wasn't that they just couldn't. It's just historically, at that point, they hadn't been pacing.
I wouldn't say that there was that much of a consensus. There were people saying that. I wouldn't quite use the word consensus.
Well, I'm saying at least in hindsight, consensus-wise. Yeah, because I wasn't even born yet, Chris. All right?
Right.
This is your reminder.
Understood. I was in college.
The fall of the Soviet Union was before I was born. Not by much, but before I was born.
Yeah, I was in graduate school. Yeah, I was in graduate school when it happened.
Yeah, it was July 91, I think is what this just said. Or August?
No, the Berlin Wall went down in 89.
No. The actual fall of the Soviet Union itself. Proper.
Oh, was it as late as 91? Or was it 1990?
No, 92.
Was it that late? That actually surprises me. I don't remember it being
something. I'm seeing something here about until May 92. What? Civil War in Georgia prevented its recognition in the establishment of diplomatic relations with the U.S. until 92. Okay, so even depending on what was taking place, you might be able to say right as I was being born, the Soviet Union fully fell.
Okay.
The last crumble bits of it.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Wikipedia article that's going to have the exact date. It says 1991, but when in 1991?
Yeah, I've got the history.state.gov page up.
Yeah, on 26 December, it was 26 December of 91, Gorbachev officially recognized the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
There we go. So yeah, my mom was pregnant with me when the Soviet Union officially fell. I wasn't even born yet. I wasn't born until May.
Stephen Ross says he was in college. I was in graduate school when that all happened.
Listen, get off my lawn. Hey, I am in my 30s, Delon. I've got my own fucking lawn, damn it.
When I remember I had appointed myself to be the skeptic in grad school. We were in the faculty lounge watching the Berlin Wall coming down on the TV they had in the faculty lounge. And I literally looked around the room and said, is anybody else going to be skeptical of this? Is anybody else going to be a naysayer? And everybody just sort of looked at me, and I said, okay, if nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to do it, because there needs to be at least one person saying I don't buy it. And so just as a matter of principle, as a matter of what is the best process for this, I decided that I was going to be the person that was going to officially be the skeptic about it. Mm-hmm. That did not mean that I was actually that skeptical about it.
Well, but I mean, sometimes you have to be the devil's advocate in situations where there has been a lot of propaganda.
I did that later when I was at working for computer companies or something. Like when I ended up working at a document management. Well, I ended up working in the department that did a bunch of document management stuff for an Italian pharmaceutical company.
You're welcome, Stephen.
And we were talking about at one point we were talking about security stuff, and I said, is anybody else going to be the paranoid security person here? And they all looked at me, and I said, all right, I guess I have to be. And so I said, this is a bad idea for the following reasons, right? Mm-hmm. And so, because somebody had to get it on the record, hey, we need to actually think about this.
Yeah.
And I think it might have been specifically, we were putting our server that had all the corporate secrets in a room that didn't have anybody in it normally, that was by our front door, which was not under direct observation from anybody, and there was no cameras, and that room didn't have a lock on it. So if you knew what you were doing,
if you knew what you were looking for, you could immediately get to it without, with unfettered access.
You could come
in. And there's
in,
no security camera to document it either.
You could come in, if the front doors were shut, which they frequently were, and the side doors were open, you could go in through the side door, pop into the server room, hit the eject button on the multimedia platter. It would kick out a disk. It just kick one out at random. It'd kick whichever one was currently in the drive, but it would kick it out the disk, and you could just put it in your pocket and walk out the door with it. So hello, new person.
Hi. Glorious. Yeah, no, that was definitely a security risk that should have been addressed well before you even got there.
Yeah. And we didn't do it because we didn't put the lock on. I wanted to put like a burly cyber lock type thing on it, and management didn't want to do it because it was going to be expensive to do it. And we ended up not doing it. But, I put it on record. This is an issue. That in a different timeline, that company wouldn't have imploded. When that company imploded, oh my God, it was so fun watching it implode. Except for the part that it was imploding all around me. That part wasn't fun, but it was like literally.
That sounds familiar.
It was the U.S. subsidiary of an Italian pharmaceutical company, and there was like stories about trying to break the union and board members getting caught crossing the border from Switzerland with records of like huge cash deposits into numbered Swiss bank accounts, and all sorts of stuff like that. Nobody does drama like the Italians, and all that stuff ended up. The U.S. company ended up going away as part and parcel of all this stuff, and I ended up having to go get another job. And in another timeline, I would have ended up in Boston working because I had implemented this document management system, and I was a trained person with this document management system. And there was a pharmaceutical company in Boston that was looking for somebody, and they put me in touch with them and said, hey, these guys are looking for you. They're looking for you. Mm-hmm. And so I started that conversation, but I ended up not moving to Boston because I elected to stay in DC with the woman who would one day be my ex-wife. Which, if I hadn't stayed in DC, I wouldn't have ended up going to the Center for Naval Analysis. I wouldn't have ended up going back into defense. I wouldn't have gone and spent time on aircraft carriers. I would not have become an intelligence officer. I would not have done any of the things that I do that allow me to say that my fandom superpowers, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. I know an awful lot about the pharmaceutical business and regulatory affairs, and I'd probably be a vice president of IT at a pharmaceutical company right now, a chief technology officer at a pharmaceutical company. But I would
very different career path.
I would not be doing Starfleet Tactical on Saturday nights at 9 o'clock. And once again, everybody, I say it every week because I mean it every week, I am honored that you folks decided that you wanted to spend your Saturday evening listening to me talk. And so I thank you. I thank you each and every week for coming and doing that. No show next week. I expect a show the week after that, but no show.
However, will be doing a show over on twitch.tv/Neo Soul God. I am the live stream director for an all black cast playing the Marvel TTRPG. It's called Delta 1619. And
I didn't realize that this was something that you were on air doing. Something.
Yes, that's the paid gig I was telling you about is an on-air thing.
I knew it was a paid gig.
I get paid to do the thing I do here.
I did not know that. I did that. That's fantastic. So for the record, for everybody, when she said
this,
when she said that she had the opportunity for a paid gig that would take her away from Starfleet Tactical every other week, I said, you should go do the paid gig because I can't pay you.
And this is the game. And we are actually partnered with Marvel behind the scenes to some degree. Like, Jay's actually been in talks with them.
So how do we get that information out to everybody? Send me the information. At a minimum, I will post it on my Facebook pages. You should post it on your Facebook pages, and you should go ahead, throw it up on the screen real quick.
All right. Oop.
And also put it in. All right. So
it
there
is
it is.
At the same time that we do this stream, so 9 p.m. Eastern. If there are tech issues, we might be about 9:30 at the latest, hopefully.
Well, no show next week, right? So you're going to be doing this next week, right? So,
yep.
So maybe I'll watch if I'm not indisposed at the time. There's a very good chance I will be hanging out with friends in Illinois at the time on my way back.
Fair enough.
So
fair enough. But yeah, that's what I will be doing this time next week.
All right. That sounds good. All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much for joining me here and joining Lissa here, and have a good week, everybody. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Guys.